If you ask anyone who John Wayne or Clint Eastwood are, they'll no doubt have heard of them. Their careers in the history of film are intimately intertwined thanks to the Western, a genre known for its films about cowboys and Native Americans. The Western has existed since the early 1800s in the form of short stories, though it was only upon the publication of Owen Wister's The Virginian in 1902 that it really became the Western genre. This was because people wanted to relive the glory days of the West, which meant exploring the idea of the frontier, aka the social divide between the natives and Americans. Fast forward nearly 40 years to Stagecoach, John Ford's directorial debut in the genre, which was produced in the Western's golden age. The film used many common ideas of the genre, but became wildly successful due to its intriguing characters, which has since solidified it as an example of a quintessential classic Western. Westerns would continue to have a huge effect on the film industry and modern media, but the genre would change in tone from stories of heroic cowboys to darker stories about the gruesome realities of the West. These are often called Revisionist Westerns, and one such example is BioShock, a narrative-centric first-person shooter produced by 2K Games and released in 2007. Though not a Western by definition, the game's story comments on many conventions specific to the genre, notably the portrayal of the Americans as the good guys. Through the setting, conflicts, characters, and ending, the game becomes comparable to the darker works of the genre, and its theme can be analyzed. Thus, by using the classic Western conventions as a lens and Stagecoach as a point of comparison, BioShock can be likened to a revisionist Western whose theme is that civilization is inherently inclined towards chaos. Identifying the theme in BioShock prompts a new perspective on Stagecoach, suggesting that the American settlers are hypocritical in their classification of the natives as savages, as they are themselves savages. In order to show how BioShock is like a revisionist Western, we first have to show how Stagecoach is a classic Western. Stagecoach is about a group of people traveling across the West in a stagecoach, a cart drawn by horses meant to transport people or goods. The passengers, who all have their own reasons for traveling, encounter many obstacles, such as surprise attacks from natives, rushing rivers, and unexpected births. Classifying this film as a Western comes down to four main aspects: setting, conflict, characters, and ending. Starting with the introductory credit roll, the film already establishes the main setting and conflict. Stagecoaches started to fall out of civilian use in the 1860s, and with the construction of the first Western railroad system in 1869, they became reserved for commercial use only. The story following a stagecoach means it had to have taken place before their disappearance as a common mode of transportation. In this scene, a character from Kansas City, a city founded in 1821, is referred to as an Easterner.
Here's a man going on the stagecoach with you. He's an Easterner from Kansas City, Missouri.
Kansas City, Kansas, brother.
Your health, Reverend.
This suggests that A, this location is further west than Kansas City, a state already considered Western in the 19th century, and B, the story takes place well after the 1820s. Combined with the vast and empty desert landscapes, the setting is solidified as the post-1860s desert of the American West. In the following scene, the silhouettes of American soldiers ride horses to a triumphant theme. Just behind them, silhouettes holding spears and wearing headbands ride horses to an imposing theme. These silhouettes are later shown to be the natives, the opposing force to the Americans. The accompanying music reflects this opposition. The Americans are portrayed as good, and the natives are portrayed as evil. This binary opposition is the foundation of the conflicts found in the classic Western. Thus, Stagecoach's opening credits show both that its setting and conflict align with the classic Western. The combination of this setting and conflict forms one of the most crucial themes of the Western genre, the frontier. The frontier is signaled by both a physical separation between the limits of a town and the empty desert, and an ideological separation between civilization and savagery. The Americans are meant to portray that civilization through their formation of towns, economies, and the birth of the next generation. Natives are meant to portray savagery through their presence in the chaotic desert and their attacks on American people and towns. Based on the US's goal to expand into the West, the Americans are meant to claim all the land so that it becomes civilized. This means bridging the gap between the savage desert lands and their towns. The manifestation of the bridging efforts is the classic Western's cowboy hero, the character involved with most of the action and conflicts. As a bridge between savagery and civilization, the cowboy hero is meant to show three major traits: moral superiority in all conflicts, controlled and elegant violence that always serves to benefit civilization, and an affinity for or knowledge of both sides. Stagecoach's hero is none other than Henry Ringo Kidd, a wrongly accused escaped convict looking to take revenge on the Plumber Boys, the thugs who killed his father and brother. He's found along the Stagecoach's trail and is arrested by the sheriff and commander of the Stagecoach, who intends to keep him in custody for the trip. In terms of moral superiority in all conflicts, Ringo is only shown in conflict twice, once against the natives, and once in a final gunfight against the Plumber Boys. Against the natives, his violence is meant to protect the other Stagecoach passengers from natives who randomly attacked them, making it justified. Against the Plumber Boys, it's shown beforehand that they're outlaws, terrifying violent cowboys who act outside the law. The Plumber Boys had not only unjustly killed Ringo's father and brother, but had also been causing havoc in the town, so it was justified for him to kill them. Additionally, his victory in their duel is celebrated, which demonstrates the second condition. In both cases, Ringo killing his opponents is shown to help society by protecting the innocent, whether it's the Stagecoach passengers or the townspeople. He's also an incredible marksman, neither missing a shot nor getting shot once. In the duel with the natives, every one of his shots hits a native or throws him off his horse, and in the duel against the Plumber Boys, all three are killed and Ringo is perfectly fine, both of which show his elegance and control when wielding a gun. Finally, he shows an affinity for both savagery and civilization. When the Stagecoach arrives at the second outpost, Ringo is able to talk with the Mexican residents, who are portrayed as savages.
Yes, ma'am. Hey, Chris. ¿Dónde la cocina?
Aquí está, kid.
He also shows good conflict resolution skills when the passengers start fighting with each other.
A gentleman doesn't smoke in the presence of a lady.
3 weeks ago, I took a bullet out of a man who was shot by a gentleman. The bullet was in his back.
You mean to insinuate...
Sit down, mister. Doc don't mean no harm.
And is inclined to treat all the women of the Stagecoach with respect, both of which show his ability to be civilized. With the natives portrayed as the savages and the cowboy hero portrayed as the bridge between savagery and civilization, based on the frontier theme, the Americans must represent civilization. These characters don't all portray the same amount of civility, however. Buck is a loudmouthed, ignorant stagecoach driver who's married to a Mexican immigrant.
I just took this job 10 years ago so I could make enough money to marry my Mexican girl, Julieta, and I've been working hard at it ever since. Bonnie, get over! Oh!
Though he's part of the town's economy, he shows an affinity for savages through his relationship with the Mexican woman and his lack of self-control.
You better get out and stretch your leg. I mean your limbs, ma'am. We're going to change horses here.
Peacock, on the other hand, is a whiskey drummer from Kansas City with a quite proper manner of speech. He's the story's Easterner, and as such, has little to or no experience in the West. His inexperience is seen through his inability to assert himself,
Samples?
and his surprise at the presence of savages.
That's my wife, Yakima, my squaw.
Yes, but she's savage.
Si, senor. She's a little bit savage, I think.
If a spectrum were to be created with the natives here, and Ringo here, Buck would be here because he's part of Western society but has a connection to those seen as savages. The outlaw Plumber Boys would be here, and Peacock would be here. It's important to note that this spectrum is based on perceived civility, meaning it's how the civil characters are seen through the eyes of the classic Western. With the extremities and center of the spectrum identified, the remaining Americans can be shown as civilized. The two women of the story, Miss Mallory and Dallas, are similar to Peacock in terms of civility. Women in the classic Western act as the damsels in distress to keep safe from the natives who would presumably rape and kill them. They're instantly placed far on the civilized side because their passive nature and their ability to raise the new generation in the classic Western prevent them from being violent and limit them to the roles of housewives and teachers. The Sheriff Curly goes here because he shares many traits with the cowboy hero, such as his controlled use of a gun and moral superiority in the conflict against the natives. However, he doesn't have the same affinity for savages. Hatfield is a gentlemanly former soldier who's good at gambling. While he's ready for any situation and swears to protect Miss Mallory with his expert gunmanship, his motives for doing so are unclear, so he'll go right here. Doc Boone is a drunkard doctor who goes here for his role in saving lives and bringing new ones into the world, specifically Miss Mallory's baby. Although Gatewood is a corrupt banker who steals from his own bank, he has a similar amount of civility to Doc Boone, because he's involved in the economy of the West. Thus, the distribution of this chart displays that the Americans in Stagecoach are portrayed as the civil society, which is in line with the character types of the classic Western. The final piece of this classic Western story is the ending. Throughout the film, Ringo falls in love with Dallas and intends to run off with her to his ranch out of state. After he kills the Plumber Boys, they leave the town, riding off into the sunset to live a new life on the ranch. He resolves all conflict and symbolically leaves behind his savage tendencies by choosing to leave town with a woman who will make him civil. This is a very common ending in the earlier classic Western. In the later stories, the cowboy hero dies while saving the town he's been protecting, or rides off into the sunset in critical condition, leaving the audience unsure of his fate. This represents the start of civilization, shown through the hero saving the town, and also represents the end of the frontier, shown through the disappearance or death of the hero. Considering that the cowboy hero is meant to advance the frontier, and seeing as it's closing when the movie takes place, the hero is no longer needed in the end, so he's only left to disappear or die along with the frontier. Thus, Stagecoach's ending, conflict, setting, and characters demonstrate that it is, in fact, a classic Western. Furthermore, the combination of these four aspects reveals a major plot point of the frontier theme. In line with historical events, the Americans will triumph over the natives, the gap of the frontier will close, and savagery will be replaced with civilization. With Stagecoach classified as a classic Western, it's time to explain how BioShock can be likened to a revisionist Western. Before breaking down the game, it's important to define the revisionist Western. These types of Westerns take the conventions proposed by the classic Western and revise them, hence the name revisionist. They're generally much darker in their themes and provide new commentary on the genre by questioning the portrayal of characters and events. Establishing the conflict and characters of BioShock is much more nuanced than Natives vs. Americans and requires much more in-game time to set up. This is especially true for the characters, who require an explanation of the ending so that they can be fully understood. Because of this, the introduction only establishes setting. Your player character, Jack, crash lands in the middle of the ocean and swims ashore to a lighthouse, which has an elevator down to an underwater city called Rapture. In the following clip, the city's founder and current leader, Andrew Ryan, explains his goals as the elevator lowers into the city.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose rapture. A city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small.
The footage being shown on a black and white TV screen and the quality of the audio are reminiscent of the technology used in the first televisions, which means that the game takes place in the middle of the 20th century. While the time period and setting aren't physically the same as the Western, they act as parallels. Where the West is an empty, vast, unexplored desert with many possibilities for danger, the ocean is equally as empty, vast, unexplored, and dangerous. Andrew Ryan's goal of separating from the world to form a new society is the same as America's goal of separating from the British Empire through the American Revolution, which resulted in the westward expansion. Thus, BioShock's physical setting is a diversion from the classic Western, but the underlying meaning behind it follows the essence of the genre, a reevaluation of established conventions that is key to the revisionist Western. Despite the conflict's complexity, one of the story's themes is still the frontier. As is revealed upon entry to the city, all isn't as good as Andrew Ryan was presenting.
I didn't mean no trespass. Just don't hurt me. Just let me go. Just keep my gun.
The city has been torn apart by the combined efforts of creatures called splicers, scientifically and psychologically mutated superhumans, and an ongoing civil war led by the remaining unmutated civilians. Splicers are the result of the scientific freedom allowed by Ryan and the discovery of a chemical substance called Atom, which allows for a person's genetics, appearance, physical capabilities, and mental state to be changed at will. In a hypocritical attempt to keep control of the city, Andrew Ryan allowed for Atom to remove the critical thinking of the public, which turned them into uncaring superhuman murderers. Their role as crazed murderers is not unlike the portrayal of natives in Stagecoach, but it differs in one major way. For the natives, their portrayal was just that, a portrayal. Historically, they were only trying to protect the land and culture that would eventually be stolen from them, and sometimes that meant opposing the Americans who would attack them. For the splicers, their biology dictates that they're unable to think for themselves and that their only mission is to kill anything that walks. If a similar spectrum were proposed, the splicers would be placed here, but there would no longer be a need for the use of the word portrayal, as the splicers are unable to act differently. In contrast, some civilians who have not been mutated are still surviving in the rubble of Rapture. Their remaining critical thinking and will to live keep them away from violent situations and portray them as civilized, which is most like Peacock and Stagecoach's women. This would place them here on the spectrum. This combination of the new society setting and a conflict between civilization and savagery demonstrates the frontier theme, but with one major point of deviation. The splicers were once regular civilized people who, over the course of Andrew Ryan's leadership, became mutated and more savage. This shows that, unlike the historical elimination of the natives and the development of American civilization, Rapture is becoming more savage as time goes on. The frontier border between civilization and savagery is therefore closing like in the classic Western, but in the opposite direction, an inversion of the frontier theme that likens the game more to revisionist Westerns. Despite showing the correlation between the setting and conflict, there's a second conflict that's just as important. The Civil War was initially led by Frank Fontaine, a megacorporation owner in Rapture who was trying to take Ryan's position as the leader. To prevent being overthrown, Ryan had Fontaine assassinated, going against his core beliefs of total freedom.
Something must be done about Fontaine. While I was buying buildings and fish futures, he was cornering the market on genotypes and nucleotide sequences. Rapture is transforming before my eyes. The great chain is pulling away from me. Perhaps it's time to give it a tug.
Despite this, he continued to push his ideas of freedom to the public. Atlas, a working-class citizen, then became the new face of the revolution and had much more success than Fontaine, getting in contact with the player character when they reach Rapture and serving as their guide. The fact that Ryan was willing to openly betray his beliefs to keep control, while still claiming that he supports those beliefs, demonstrates the second conflict, civilization versus its own self-destructive tendencies. Much like the US versus Britain during the American Revolution, Andrew Ryan wanted to separate from the ideals of his American homeland, so he created Rapture with his opposing political ideas. These political ideas, defined by total freedom and the desire to separate from governmental authority, can be described as anarchist. The extent of his system's freedom is displayed by an artist character, Sander Cohen, who can freely and legally use the bodies of people he's killed in his art. These types of people became more common in Rapture over time, including scientists experimenting with Adam, and the public started demanding control of it to prevent total collapse. In trying to keep the public from shattering his utopia, Ryan contradicted his own views of freedom by suppressing their free speech. When they didn't get the government they wanted, they tried to force a change through a revolution. This sequence of events is similar to totalitarian regimes such as the USSR, a communist extreme left society which touted equality for all but ended with an extreme divide between the working class and the leaders. In their case, it was shown that total equality would not function, as someone had to be in power to enforce the proposed ideology, which contradicted the idea of total equality. Thus, the only solution would be a political middle ground, but as is shown by Ryan's monologue at the start of the game, those don't work either. Because they adhere to both sides of the political spectrum, they push people with poorly represented ideas towards separating and creating new societies. Such was the case for the US and Britain, and according to Ryan, such was the case for him as well. Therefore, while BioShock presents a revision of the frontier theme, it also puts forth the idea that, regardless of the political system, the conditions of the frontier's creation will breed opinions that differ enough to prompt the development of new societies based on flawed ideas that are bound to malfunction and cause chaos. Since Jack is the player character, it's assumed that he's the cowboy hero. But is he really? Or is it more apt to describe him as an enabler of chaos? That answer can be found in, among other things, his interactions with creatures called the Little Sisters. These young girls have been brainwashed through the use of Adam to recollect the chemical from the corpses of dead splicers. They're often sought after by the splicers because the splicers are addicted to Adam, and the sisters are full of it. Throughout the game, Jack will find them accompanied by large armored creatures called Big Daddies. These creatures will stop at nothing to protect the girls, even if it means sacrificing themselves. They're slow and calculated in their attacks, opting most often to charge into Jack with their heavy armor, and they only use guns when necessary. Additionally, they only attack if they were provoked by Jack. If Jack kills a Big Daddy, he can harvest the little sister and take her Adam to upgrade his combat abilities. Based on how the little sister is harvested, one of two things happens. Either the girl is saved from her brainwashing and Jack gets less of the resource, making him less powerful, or Jack chooses to kill her and fully harvests the resource. The game therefore introduces levels of morality to the cowboy hero, something not seen in the classic Western. If he chooses to save the girl, he would be showing moral superiority through his protection of women. If he chooses instead to kill the girl, he would be showing moral ambivalence, as he would be doing it solely for personal gain. Killing the girl, who is a representation of civilization, is an action that is expected of the natives who would presumably rape and kill women, as per the classic Western. This alone would demonstrate how different Jack is from the traditional cowboy hero, but there is still the scenario where he saves the girl. However, factoring in that scenario still doesn't make him morally superior, as many of his other killings are done for personal gain. For example, the artist Sander Cohen disables Jack's means of transportation and forces him to kill some people to create a sculpture out of corpses. When the sculpture is finished, Cohen lets down his guard and frees Jack. If Jack then kills the passive Cohen, he gets extra loot, but he wasn't prompted to do so for any other reason, making the killing unjustifiable. Even if he doesn't kill him, Jack could have sought out a less violent way to get out of Cohen's trap, but instead, he chose to do what he was told. It's appropriate to call Jack's violence controlled, as he has limited ammo so he's inclined to play tactically, but it's far from elegant. His violence is quite gruesome, often employing the use of explosives, a wrench for bludgeoning, and elemental abilities such as gusts of wind to launch people in the air so they die from the fall, ice to freeze them to death, and fire to burn them to death. Additionally, it's hard to say if his violence benefits society because there's hardly any society to benefit from it. For argument's sake, the killing of splicers will be considered beneficial to society, seeing as they were the ones who destroyed it in the first place and who continue to propagate chaos. Because they're the most common enemy in the game, it can be said that his violence benefits society more than it destroys it. Finally, Jack shows no affinity for civilization. Because he's controlled by the player, there are only so many things he's capable of, including understanding a language and following orders. His moral ambivalence points to a lack of concern for societal norms, as he will do almost anything for personal gain, which demonstrates an affinity for savagery. This analysis makes Jack more comparable to the outlaws than the cowboy hero, though since he has more than one possible course of action, he falls in two different places on the spectrum. Here, if he saves the girl, as he demonstrates a basic moral code but is still responsible for many other killings, and here if he kills the girl instead. The portrayal of the cowboy hero as anything but a hero massively differs from the conventions of the classic Western, which further demonstrates BioShock's similarities to revisionist Westerns. In the end of the game, Jack kills Andrew Ryan and it's revealed that Atlas, the revolutionary and Jack's guide, was Fontaine all along and he had simply faked his death to ward off Ryan. With the success of his plan, Fontaine takes over Rapture and tries to kill Jack, as he's the only person who could possibly stop him. Jack ends up defeating Fontaine, but the ending differs depending on his previous decisions. If he chose to free all the Little Sisters, he leaves Rapture with some of the girls he saved and lives happily ever after with them. This is analogous to the ending of earlier classic Westerns, but the ending has a very bleak underlying message. In the classic Western, the society the hero leaves behind is able to survive without him and will in fact thrive, so he's no longer needed. In BioShock, Rapture could not possibly survive in its current state even if someone tried to fix it, so instead of staying, they leave. As per the game's inversion of the frontier theme, savagery won over civilization, so the only option left is to return to the civilization Ryan sought to break free from. In the classic Western, this would be like the Americans losing to the natives and deciding to return to Britain. If Jack chose instead to kill even one of the girls, the Splicers leave Rapture, intending to spread their murderous rampage to civilizations on the surface. In the classic Western, this would be like the natives killing all the Americans, then traveling to Britain to kill them as well. The first ending displays a classic ending while respecting the earlier assessment about the self-destruction of civilization and the eventual chaos. The second one goes further with the assessment, suggesting that the malfunction and chaos will spread to other civilizations. Both of these endings continue with the idea of the inversion of the frontier theme, and therefore liken the game to a revisionist Western. With BioShock's characters and the extremities of its spectrum thoroughly established, the cast can finally be placed on the spectrum. To begin with an easy one, the Little Sisters are analogous to the women of the classic Western. When they're brainwashed, they're protected by the Big Daddies, but when Jack kills these Big Daddies, the girls are at his mercy, which shows that they're helpless in violent situations. The Big Daddies are meant to oppose Jack's attempts to harvest the sisters, meaning that their role in the story is defined by his choices. If Jack intends to free the sisters, the daddies are essentially acting as kidnappers and are therefore outlaw types. If Jack intends to kill them, they're actually more comparable to the cowboy hero because they protect women, which demonstrates moral superiority. They do so through the use of slow and calculated attacks, which demonstrates controlled and elegant violence, and when they're not fighting, they mind their own business and are kind towards the sisters. The Big Daddies therefore have a big significance in relation to Jack. Depending on which choice he makes, they will be placed in an equal and opposite position. If Jack is here, then the Big Daddies are here, and vice versa. Similar to Gatewood, Andrew Ryan is a corrupt businessman. Unlike Gatewood, it's shown that Ryan had a genuine idea in the beginning and slowly became corrupt, which means he became more savage over time. Initially he would have gone here, but based on how we see him in the present in the game, he goes here. Fontaine is very similar to Andrew Ryan in that he had genuine ideas at first, but they became corrupted over time as well. His manipulation of the public into believing he was on their side with his Atlas persona paints him as another outlaw, especially considering that he betrays the public when he finally gets what he wants. Sander Cohen is meant to be sophisticated, considering that he's an artist, which would classify him as civilized, if not for the fact that he actively takes pleasure in manipulating, torturing, and killing people. Before he moved to Rapture, he was a level-headed person, but the freedom provided by Rapture allowed him to become more and more experimental with his work. Thus, He's placed all the way here, as the only difference between him and the Splicers is that he chose to be deranged. In contrast to the classic Western, where the settling Americans are meant to portray civilization, the settlers in BioShock are initially portrayed as civilized until their true savage tendencies are revealed, a revision of character archetypes that further likens the game to revisionist Westerns. Although BioShock displays many re-evaluations of the classic Western, it can't be classified as a revisionist Western because it wasn't made with that genre in mind. BioShock's lack of committal to the Western genre is shown in its exploration of other themes like scientific experimentation, class division, and mental control. But its continual depiction of the frontier keeps it close enough to the genre to say that it evokes the revisionist Western. Thus, it can be said that BioShock's distance from the genre allows it to take the themes to their logical extremes to display the underlying hypocrisy, but its closeness to the frontier theme allows for commentary on the classic Western in a similar way to the revisionist Western. In BioShock, the savage splicers are portrayed as the natural progression of civilized people. Of course, the original goal was to create superhumans that still had common sense, but the freedom of Rapture allowed for the experimentation to make civilized people into savages. In the classics, Americans believed that they were right in bringing civilization to the West by murdering natives under the guise of the West being lawless. BioShock's commentary suggests that the Americans, though well-meaning in their establishment of towns, became corrupted in their views and turned into the savages they claimed to be ridding the West of, making them hypocritical. Inversely, the natives become the portrayal of civility, given that their attacks were only in retaliation to the attacking Americans. This new conclusion inverts the spectrum derived from Stagecoach, placing the Americans on the savage side and the natives on the civil side. The people who are not inclined towards violence remain on the civilized side, though not forever. Andrew Ryan, for example, devolves from an entrepreneur with a dream to a frantic leader doing everything in his power to keep control of the city. He remains civilized throughout, but slowly becomes as savage as the Splicers. At the end of Stagecoach, Peacock is shown to be more assertive, preemptively correcting someone's pronunciation of his name, knowing that they'll get it wrong.
Goodbye, Miss Dallas. If you ever come to Kansas City, Kansas, I want you to come out to see us.
Oh, thanks, Mr.
Peacock.
Though a very minor event, this shows that over time, the civilized Easterner will succumb to the values of the West, and the chaos will prevail over civility. Though the cowboy hero is portrayed as the middle of the spectrum, that couldn't be further from the truth. Jack's ending, where he lives happily ever after with the girls, is preceded by killing a ton of splicers to get to Andrew Ryan and eventually Fontaine, both of whom he also kills. He's presented as the game's good guy, but in reality, he was just the best person in a city full of terrible people. In Stagecoach, though Ringo rides off into the sunset with his new lover, he still commit a crime in killing the Plumber Boys. They were outlaws, but he did murder them in cold blood. The sheriff letting him go demonstrates the disillusion the Americans had to killing and further displays the devolution of their civilization into chaos. Finally, based on what BioShock presents about the formation of new civilizations ending in chaos, it stands to reason that the country the Westerners are trying to create will succumb to the same fate. Much like Britain was for the Americans before the Revolution, it will become a breeding ground for ideas so polarizing that it will cause yet another split, and the country will plunge into chaos. These new revelations about the genre change the way the viewer sees Stagecoach and classic Western stories in general. No longer are these stories about the Americans triumphing over natives and saving the day. Instead, they're about hypocritical murderers forming a society that's doomed to fail. In conclusion, by looking back on Stagecoach and the classic Western with the perspective of BioShock's commentary that civilization is inclined towards chaos, the Americans are revealed to be hypocritical through their savage actions. Despite my in-depth explanation of BioShock, the game offers so much more in terms of theme and commentary on genres. It delves deep into the idea of choice in video games, and goes on to display traits of yet another type of Western, called the postmodern Western. This type of Western not only pushes the breaking of classic Western conventions to its limits, but actively mocks the genre it claims to be about.